Hello, leaders, and welcome to Leadership Excellence. My name is Danny Langloss. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are joined by Kristen Ziman, the Aurora, Illinois Police Chief. I've known Kristen for some time now. As people are familiar with, I was the police chief of Dixon for 10 years. Kristen is on the front edge of leadership in policing. And today we're going to take on a very important topic, and that's policing in America. There's so many challenges facing our great profession, and there are challenges that this profession is ready to step up and meet, but to do that with key stakeholders. I think Kristen is going to provide incredible insight into this. We're going to learn about her career, her rise to police chief. Aurora, I believe, Kristen, Aurora is the second largest community in Illinois.
Yes,
is that correct?
second largest city in Illinois. Something to bring up at your next cocktail party.
Something at the next cocktail party. And so I just couldn't be more excited. Kristen holds many different positions. Like, I have no idea how she has time to sleep. She's a vice president at large with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a phenomenal organization, executive board member at the Police Executive Research Forum, which is PERF, co-chair recruitment and training on the Presidential Commission of Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, Illinois Sentencing Policy Advisory Council, Supreme Court Commission on Pretrial Practices, Final Report Implementation Task Force, co-chair of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police Diversity Committee. Wow. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
How do you find time to be involved in all of these different, very important things?
Yeah, when you just read that, it struck me. I'm like, wow, why am I so tired? It is, it's a lot of prioritizing. I'm fortunately in a time in my life where, my kids are all in college. So I have that time to devote now fully, when you talk about work-life balance, and people have always asked me that, how do you work-life balance? And, and the honest answer is I'm terrible at it. If I'm doing a really good job in policing at my job, then I'm usually failing somewhere, as a parent and as a partner, but if I'm, and then vice versa. So it's been, here's the honest to God answer is these organizations make me better as a police chief, and that makes me better to serve my officers in my community. And so I think that we have to make time in order to become more knowledgeable. I have learned so much by being a part of IACP. That's the gold standard of, policy across the entire nation and internationally. Being a part of PERF, and those are the two top ones as far as police research. These are the subject matter experts, the melting pot of intellect and data and research. And so just being a part of that and making time for that, it's a force multiplier. So, the answer is sometimes I'm running in 17 different directions. But interesting enough with COVID, it's actually, if there's one silver lining with COVID, it's taught me that we can also work smarter. So, with now the Zoom calls, I'm not getting on a plane and traveling, to these meetings. So we're actually being pretty efficient right now. So, it's all seeming to work right now, but it's important to make time for that, to prioritize.
Well, there's, policing, there's never been a time in policing where there's been a greater need for leadership and for leaders like you to step up and step forward. I know when I was running for vice president of the Illinois Chiefs a few years ago, one of the things I said was major change and reform is coming to law enforcement. And we can either be the change, create the change and lead the change, or we can be victims of change. And we need more leaders like you stepping up, especially in times like these, to lead that change.
I appreciate that. However, I think that leadership in a sense is overglorified, in that it's truly the followers that make an organization. And we saw this with COVID. I've been the police chief now for, over 4.5 years, almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in January. And we had a mass shooting in February of 19, where 5 of my cops got shot and 5 civilians were killed. And that was, when in that moment of, leadership, But truly it was, it was everyone doing the thing that they were supposed to do. It was cops running towards gunfire and getting shot one after another. And, and I bring that up because, again, I was the one standing at the podium, and that's leadership to stand at the podium. But really, I was just telling the story of the true heroes that did the thing, the first line. And then you add on top of that our next crisis, which is COVID. And by the way, leading during COVID was a very interesting thing, because I will acknowledge wholeheartedly, I had no idea what I was doing. And I told my department that is, you guys, this is a pandemic, and we know how to do a mass shooting, right? That's operational. We know how to handle an incident. No matter what is thrown at us, we've got this. You throw something like a pandemic, and I'm not sure, what the police are supposed to be doing. Do we, how do we handle this? And then once again, as patterned, these officers stepped up, started working 12-hour shifts, we're on 8s, and put themselves out there in a different kind of harm's way with a virus, and went out there and policed our community and kept it safe, during this crisis. Then you have the riots, and there they are again doing the thing that they do. So, I love that, people say, wow, it's leadership, but truly leadership is over glorified. And it's the people who are doing the work, that are the ones that should, be given, all the accolades.
Spoken like a true leader in the essence of great leadership and servant leadership. It's funny because when you think about leadership isn't about doing the job and doing the things. It's taking care of the people that are doing the job and doing the things. And what you just talked about, and a few incredible examples that will blow most of our listeners away, is why I believe policing is one of the most honorable and noble professions in the entire country.
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
So when I hear you talk, I hear incredible passion, incredible energy, and that comes from purpose. What are you most passionate about?
I am most passionate about police officers. And I say that, in an unpopular time right now where police officers are not everyone's favorite. But I came into this profession at 17 years old. I literally graduated from high school in June and started as a police cadet, which is the same as an intern, in July. And the reason that I chose this profession is because my father was a police officer. And what I started to note in my formative years is that he would run towards things that other people just kept driving by. For example, at 10 years old, he said, "Don't move, stay in the car." I'm in the back of my dad's station wagon, and he's, pulling people out of a car that just got into an accident. And another occasion, he's saying, "Don't move." And he's wrestling the keys from a drunk driver who had just hit someone. And so I thought, that's so weird. Everybody is buzzing by. That told me something about first responders. And so that's why I wanted to get into the profession. When I got into the profession, I started to realize that most officers get into the profession for the very same thing, because their molecules are built, with service in mind, and fundamental fairness and equity, and being a voice for those who don't have a voice. So I am passionate about police officers who are in alignment with the nobility and the noble the noble responsibility that befalls policing. I am passionate about what policing can be, and I know that it has its faults. So I am not one of those who sit here and say, we are so good and we're perfect and we don't need to change. That couldn't be further from the truth. I'm passionate about getting policing to the point where everyone else sees it the way that we see it. And it's interesting because the ebb and flow, of Gallup polls is that it's like this, after 9/11, we're, up here. And then, then you have Rodney King, and then, our approval rating is lower. There's always an ebb and flow, or a pendulum shift, as it were. And, and I think that the thing I am most passionate about is just trying to get people to, both inside the profession, get the noble ones to stay, and to weed out the ones who are dishonoring our badge, tarnishing our badge. and then, to get the public at large, the community, to see what I see in the servant hearts of these first responders.
I think one of the hardest things for people like you and I, who you are leading, I have led a police department that's full of character, full of integrity, based in a foundation of anti-racism, that wants to help those who can't help themselves, that wants to give a voice to the voiceless and a face to the faceless. But the problem is that across the United States, there are 18,000 police departments. Mm-hmm. And of those 18,000 police departments that have millions, hundreds of millions of contacts a year, there are incidents occur. There are bad things that happen. And unfortunately, as a profession, what happens in Minneapolis, we wear that.
Yeah.
And that's wearing. And it's funny, you talk about the ups and downs and the ebbs and flows. You talk about 9/11 and Rodney King, but let's talk about COVID, mm-hmm. and our first responders and our heroes, mm-hmm. and a pedestal. And then we talk about the unjustified and inexcusable murder of George Floyd. And now it's defund every police department across the country. And that's tough. But it also shows the special kind of men and women it takes, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Muslim, to put on this badge and to go out and serve in spite of all that. Yeah. I'm drawn to a story of a person who had their bicycle stolen. I was reading this online, and the police show up and they meet with this person who has this huge defund the police sign in their yard. Mm-hmm. And they go out and they find and recover the bike, and they make the arrest, and they return it, and they provide the highest levels of service for this person. And that just really exemplifies what this profession is all about.
Oh, absolutely. And in the same way that when you have protesters holding signs up, that are terribly disparaging to the police, and yet the police are there to protect them. And, and that's what it is. It's that you mentioned the sense of purpose, this alignment to something, bigger than us. And so the good police officers, which, by the way, are the majority of the police officers, understand a person's right to protest, understand, a person's right to feel the way they do. But you mentioned defunding the police, in George Floyd. And, so let's go backwards to that moment in time where, George Floyd was killed, where that police officer put his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and over 8 minutes and 40 seconds, and what that felt like. And for me in that moment, and for most police officers in that moment, and I have said this loudly and I will say it boldly again, is that if you didn't watch that and you didn't think that there was something terribly wrong with that, and that was just murder, then turn in your badge. And so if you didn't have that feeling, then you shouldn't be in this profession. But what strikes me about that particular moment in time that didn't happen in my city, it didn't happen in my state, we're not making headlines, is that just like that, the pendulum shifts. It just completely shifts to, we hate the police, defund, abolish. And what I've tried to tell my police officers is that you are the same person that you were before that cop killed George Floyd. You put this uniform on that afternoon and you're there's nothing different. But the public is viewing you with the same broad brush. We're being painted with that. And that is the cross that we have to bear. There's nothing that we can do about it. The only thing that we can do is stay resilient and continue to do our jobs, show up to the houses that call 911, even if they have a defund the police sign in their front yard, even if they're disparaging towards us. You still have a job to do, which is based on service and fundamental fairness. And that job cannot be wavered. And I think our police officers, it's a testament to their character that they continue to show up and answer 911 calls. And as far as defunding the police, so interesting, because the truth of the matter is policing, since I've been in the profession for now 27 years, we've been yelling that not necessarily in that term, right? Defund the police, but we've been saying, stop putting all of these social ails on the shoulders of police officers. We are dealing with homelessness. We are dealing with mental illness. We are dealing with substance abuse, none of which most are criminal in nature, but we are the first ones called, to those events that happen in people's lives. And we've been saying for years, we're not trained to do that. Well, now mental illness, I have 307 cops who have been trained in CIT and crisis intervention training. So they can handle, going to mental illness calls. But that's what we've been, again, touting for years. So when people say defund the police, I don't want you to do it at the expense of my budget, because 91% of my budget is personnel. So if you defund my agency, then we're not going to be able to provide the level of service that we have. But I fully support funding social service agencies to assist us.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. Like, we talk about the impact of an act, thousands of miles from us, right? Mm-hmm. on us locally. And that's really because we are seen as an institution as a whole, which is a difficult thing as we talk to our officers and keep their spirits and their morale and their mindset in the right place. That's a tough thing. We'll take that on in a few minutes. But this defund the police thing, the other thing we've talked a lot is we can't just hear, we have to listen. Mm. And defund the police isn't about a true eliminate the police and take away their budgets. I mean, that might be in a few little, but it's really about, we need change. In 2020, with all that's happened and all the reform and all the great things, how is it even possible for 4 police officers to kill a man in broad daylight with 50 or 60 people standing around knowing they're being videotaped, right? That shocks it shocks your conscience, it shocks your officer's conscience, it shocks everybody's conscience.
Yeah. How does that happen? Obviously, you have a failure in not only policy, but let's just say policy perhaps has it written that there's a duty to intercede, that there is a duty, to preserve life above all. But policy means nothing if the culture is that allows for it, that those acts of omission or, just being complicit in it. So what that tells me in that organization, and usually I'm uncomfortable, talking about other organizations and failures, but I will front and center say that's obviously a failure if you have one police officer who is doing something and 3 are watching and don't do anything about it. So that tells me the culture there is broken. And when that culture is broken, you have to fix it. So policy can say one thing. Policy says thou shalt not, commit excessive force. And then if you have officers that do it, and with other officers standing at their side, or they give locker room high fives, then your policies mean nothing if you don't enforce those policies. And that means that every single person on the department, not just supervisors, but those who stand next to you, your peers, must have the ability and be empowered to say, hey, enough, I'll take it from here, and we've seen that. That is, you mentioned about how, law enforcement is sometimes it can be messy. There are people who don't go with the program. We call them our no people, right? We've got our yes people, our maybe people, and our no people. The no people are the ones who are non-compliant, the ones who, no matter what we say or do, they are going to put up a fight. So is that pretty? No, it doesn't look good on video. It doesn't look good anywhere. And then we also see officers who are human beings that perhaps can, find themselves getting agitated. So what we train in our department is we actually put officers through this experiential training. We set up role players where we have an officer wearing this uniform that is put in a scenario where they're committing an act of excessive force. They may be, kneeing someone who's in handcuffs, and we send 2 officers in, and see how they respond. And if they do not pull that officer off, if they do not remove that officer from that situation, then, we stop the scenario and say, why did you do that? It has to be built into the DNA of an organization. And that means de-escalation has to be built into every training scenario. Duty to intercede has to be reminded at every single step of the way that this is your duty. Not only are you saving that officer, but you're also preserving, a life, humanity in the process. So culture and policy have to be in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. They do. And I agree with you 100%. When I look, I've talked to my Black friends and my white friends, and my Hispanic friends and my male friends and my female friends about this. And when I watch the video of those Minneapolis police officers, I don't know that anything changes if George Floyd is white or Hispanic, right? What I see is a systematic culture issue. When you're willing to do that in broad daylight with spectators, knowing you're being video recorded, that's not the first time that's happened. It's the first time it's happened publicly and a death has resulted. Do you agree? Do you think that incident had anything to do with race at all?
I don't know. I don't know the police officer, and you talk about trying to get in someone's head, right? And obviously, our African-American brothers and sisters have had enough of this. And now, as it turns out, George Floyd is an African-American, and that was the 1,000 tiny cuts, as a metaphor. And that was the proverbial straw. It was enough is enough. Now, to ask me, do you think it was race related? I would have to get inside that police officer's head. Would he have done that to a white person? I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think that we as police officers, especially the bystanders that were police officers standing there watching this happen, for me, it wouldn't, it doesn't matter. This is humanity. This is, again, first and foremost, we preserve life. And that was most certainly a demonstration of the contrary. And so I can't answer that. I don't know what that officer's motivation was, but, I guess one has to, add 2 + 2 is 4. And you have, our like I said, African-Americans being killed at the hands of police officers, in that some of them that same way, unjustified. And, I think you have to look at it in that way, or at least consider that fact.
Well, it's absolutely reasonable for people to draw that conclusion.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that's really hard for officers, I talk to officers, you talk to officers, is when you're a police officer that's always treated people fairly,
Mhm.
that has never discriminated against anybody, regardless of gender, religion, ethnicity, right? To hear these things and hear these attacks. But I have to tell you, and we'll see how you felt about it. But I thought when Chief Cunningham, the former president of IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, stood in front of 15 or 20,000 law enforcement executives in San Diego several years ago and apologized on behalf of our institution for the racism and the discrimination and the improper treatment of communities of color. I thought that was amazing. That was a great first step as an institution. What was your take on that?
I had never been more proud to be a part of the International Association of Chiefs of Police at the leadership of Terry Cunningham when that happened. Now, I will tell you, a lot of people quit the IACP as a result of that. I will say for those that quit, they gained even more members, but there are a certain small percentage of people that felt that was in this, and you've heard this argument before. Well, I didn't do it, I did not do that. So why am I being held responsible? And this is funny because this is on my desk. Okay, it may not be your fault, but you're responsible. And so it's none of the systemic racism that has been built into law enforcement is none of our fault. But are we responsible? Yes, because we wear the uniform. And I don't know how, it doesn't take anything away from any of us to say, we acknowledge that that happened and that pain is real. And whether you personally have felt it or not, people have. It is real. And if you don't have the intellectual capacity to try and understand the pain of someone else, just using that empathy. And again, I'm a white female, so I have never experienced that. My deputy chief, both the one who just retired and my current deputy chief, are both African-American males who have told me stories in their lives about being discriminated against. And I've never felt it. They asked me, hey, your son, how many times has he been pulled over? I have a 20-year-old son. And from the time he's had his license for 4 years. And, and I said, oh gosh, he kind of drives like a jerk sometimes. He's been pulled over, maybe like 3 times. And they're like, yeah, my son's been pulled over in double digits, a young Black man. What do you make of that? We live in the, in the same area, and how can you not say that there's a disparity there? So to answer your question, and I'm being long-winded about it, is that as a profession, we have to acknowledge the oppression. We have to acknowledge that at some point in time, law enforcement was part of this systematic racism, and we have to acknowledge it, and we have to now build back better.
Yeah. So I think the so many amazing points there. One of the things you said that it's hard for us to do, right? But we have to put ourselves in their shoes.
Yes.
We have to understand their experience and where they're coming from. Because the truth is, in the history of American law enforcement, for the majority of that time, the police were used to implement and execute very racist practices that were discriminatory. In 1838, and this is where I think this is important, like to be taught in the academies, mm-hmm. and for us to understand. In 1838, the American Institution of Policing, the first formal municipal police department, was created in Boston, Massachusetts. It was created with the initial intent to protect goods and services by the wealthy. They were tired of paying for it, and they saw a public good. Very quickly, the people in power began to use those police officers to intimidate their political rivals for their own gain. A matter of fact, that's when the people in power, the party in power, promoted the captains and lieutenants of the precincts and stuff. In the South, the institution of policing a few years later was adopted with a primary function to preserve the institution of slavery. And in fact, during the Jim Crow lynchings, half of those police officers were present. Another quarter of those, they knew and did nothing, right? And so we're not responsible for that. But then when we look at, you step through the days in the 1900s and, in the mid-1900s and the early 1900s, and, the segregation, and you got to sit in the back of the bus, or you can't go into this restaurant. And so we've got to understand and own as an institution. And that's what I thought was so powerful about Chief Cunningham coming out and doing that. We have to understand that when you're 70 years old, right? A Black man who's 70 years old, and what you've gone through and what your experiences are, and is as people, as parents, as communities, we pass on what those experiences, right? And those are real. And it's not your fault, and it's not my fault. We've never done that, but it's the fault of the institution. And we chose to join this institution. And I'm a big fan of, whenever there's a problem, we have to first ask, we have to first, what part of the problem am I? In this case, what part of the problem are we? And we have to eliminate ourselves from that and own it. And we've got to seek first to understand, then be understood. And in the words of Stephen Covey, have it for. And we've got to put ourselves in those shoes. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important for us to educate police leaders, to educate police officers, mm-hmm. on this situation, because then we're going to be much better equipped to take these issues on. Your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. And I think what happens is that there's some, perhaps a naivete that when you come into the profession, and if you don't know the history, and that's why you hit it, that this should be taught in the academies, because I don't think people realize that's why the mindset is, I didn't do that. I wasn't alive at that time. My grandparents weren't alive at that time, and so we have this tendency to say, I had nothing to do with that. So therefore this should not fall on my shoulders. But I think that, again, as an intellectual thinking human being, we have to be able to hold that opposing thought in our head to say, but people were affected by this. And I am now in this institution that was responsible for that at that time. And, and laws were built. You have to, it's not just police officers, legislation was made again to oppress, it was built into our system. And that's exactly right. You mentioned, how law enforcement was used to make sure that slaves didn't run away, and so that's precisely why, that people view our institution in that way. And now this is where that we can sit here all day and I tout all day, I am a progressive police chief, in the evolution of policing, we've gotten more professional. We then adopted Sir Robert Peel's The Public Are the Police and the Police Are the Public. And then we brought in community policing. And so we have made great strides. I mean, when I came into policing, there was not one female in a supervisory rank. I can go back to the first female that was ever allowed to put a uniform on, and that happened, in the late 60s. And so it wasn't that long ago. But that is nothing compared to, as a female, that doesn't even scratch the surface, of the pain and suffering, again, by our African American brothers and sisters. And so we have to acknowledge that. And thank you for saying seek first to understand and then be understood, because once you understand the history, well, then you can't unknow it. When you know better, you do better. And so then you're more sensitive and more empathic to that. And so I think that it should be mandatory for every police officer to be given that history and that knowledge so they can better police and they can understand and, again, do better than our ancestors.
Yeah, 100%. When you know better, you do better. I love that. I wrote that down. I think that's incredible. I love your passion for this. I love the acknowledgement. We seek to understand. We seek to empathize and those things, but we never truly will. And that's why listening right now and truly listening, not just hearing what's said, but listening and understanding is so important. Another thing that really struck me as I was trying to grapple with this and think about this and the sentiment against and the negativity towards saying all lives matter. And it was put very succinctly. And it's something I've been sharing a lot with our teams and our officers, people I talk to, was that concept of all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. And that really drove it home very succinctly for me.
Yeah, I struggle with this so much. That, when someone says Black Lives Matter and then it's combated with Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter. And I firmly believe that until all Black lives matter, then none of the others can matter as well. And again, this is, I say this all the time, but it's this anti-intellectualism that cannot seem, to grasp the concept that it takes nothing away from you to acknowledge that Black lives matter when in our history they didn't. And so to acknowledge the fact that, say it, say it, racism is wrong, Black lives matter, say that, believe that, and then all of us, can matter, but not until then.
Yeah. 100%. It doesn't take anything away from us. And I think that there's a big difference between being against racism and being anti-racist, being intolerant of racism. Mm-hmm. And as individuals and people and as police organizations and as institutions, we have to be anti-racist. So there's three things right now, Kristen, that people that are drawing the protest, many peaceful, right? Let's point out that many people of many different ethnicities, of both genders, are going out in peaceful protests demanding change. And some have turned violent and very, very destructive. They've been very destructive in your community, but they seem to be centered around police brutality, mm-hmm. police racism, and a failure of police accountability. Mm-hmm. So what do you see as some of the solutions? What do we need to do as a police institution, right, to start to solve some of these challenges?
Right. Wow. If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be on my own private island somewhere, because I don't know the answer. And I can try to work through it. Is that you have a group of peaceful protesters that who tried honestly to protest peacefully by kneeling, and that was met with such opposition. So then you have people taking to the streets, and that's when we see a tipping point, when people come out and let their voices be heard. That's when real change happens. And that is I'm so in favor of that, no matter what your cause is, what your passion is. But this brought people to the streets. But we have a small faction who are using it as an opportunity to loot and to set things on fire, to steal, to be violent. And I know that our greatest leaders in history, during civil unrest were promoting peace, and all of the people that we look up to, said violence is not the answer. I stand firmly with that. So, I was just talking with a group of officers yesterday. We were just all standing around, of course, solving the problems of the world, while we're, hanging around the water cooler. And I asked them, I said, how do you stop this? Because we're looking at Chicago, it happened here. How do you stop people from coming in and damaging property? And what I struggle with as well is that in Aurora, we have the majority of our businesses are Latinx owned. And, so people of color have these businesses that were being stolen from. And so, it defies logic to some people. How can you come in and minority owned businesses, persons of color, and hurt them, and it doesn't make sense. So we have this faction of opportunists that are coming in just to wreak havoc. But how do you stop it? What's the answer? And so on one side of the equation, you have, hands off. Look what happened in Seattle. The city council voted to take away all less lethal options from the police. So they couldn't use, any OC spray. They couldn't use anything. And so that meant that the police said, okay, we have to step back. We have to take a step back. So what happened? All of the property, it was looted and it was destroyed. So then once again, the pendulum shifts. Okay, now hold on. We need the police to come in. So option two, the other side is that you have people standing there in uniform and full force protecting property. What's the right answer? And I think that we leave that to the public to decide. You have a lot of business owners, community members that will say, I want the police standing in front of my property, blocking that street off. But then you have another, percentage that says, no, let this happen. The police should not stand in our way. I fall into the category that we have to protect, again, lives, priority, life, the preservation of life is our number one priority. Number two is protection of property, because we are protecting our taxpayers, our community members, our business owners. We owe it to them to protect their property. And so I fall into that category, is that we have to protect, those business owners. They are people. And so it is their livelihoods. We have to protect that. Do I believe that, that violence, should occur? No, I would hope not. I mean, but we have to also meet violence with violence, sadly, and that's the struggle, and you'll get people on the other side of the coin that say, step aside and let us damage this property. And I struggle with that as a law enforcement officer. I struggle with that. And, and I think we have to protect.
I agree. And I really appreciated, there's been so many Black leaders that have come out and spoken on this, representatives of Black Lives Matter. And I think we should make it real clear to our listeners that Black Lives Matter does not support the destruction of property or violence. In fact, I've seen many things where they're calling for an end to that, because it defeats what they're trying to do. That's not what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed in. That's not what's created so much progress. That divides, that puts us farther apart at greater odds. And so I think it is important for people to understand, if they if they see this violence, the media unfortunately creates our reality and creates our perception, and the media is driving so many of these problems, right? The police have so much to own from our history and from things that happen, right? The 4 officers involved in Minneapolis, especially the main officer, he needs to own what he did, mm-hmm. right? But by the same token, like we want to work hand in hand with our communities of color to solve these issues. And then this small group of people are giving everything this very bad impression. Right. When most of what's happened across our country are peaceful protests. And so much of this is driven by the media. And I hope that one day, and I doubt it, that the media will become more responsible, mm-hmm. right? Because if the media was reporting all the amazing things that are happening at the Aurora Police Department, the Dixon Police Department, the Chicago Police Department, the Seattle Police, all these different departments, then the perception wouldn't be when the police make the national news that we kill people unlawfully and that we target people of color. Does that happen? Yes. Is one incident too much? Absolutely. But the way that this shapes and creates the perception, that's exactly what's happened that has hurt somewhat the Black Lives Matter movement there. The glorification of that, when in fact 95% of these protests have all been peaceful.
I totally agree. I'll take this opportunity to say that I believe that there are a lot of good journalists out there that are seeking the truth and report the truth. But unfortunately, our media conglomerates, have become partisan. But I have a lot of respect for those journalists who, again, report both sides without swaying it or tainting it in any way. And it's one of the reasons why I, in this department, have basically made it our policy that the only truth that you see is coming from our platforms. So if, media will put out a snippet, and as they will put out the snippet, of the angle that they want, disregarding the rest. And then basically they let people, they kind of force people to draw a conclusion, and so that's why in this department, I have said, release the video from beginning to end so you can see the entire picture. And if it doesn't come from our social media, one of our platforms, then it is not considered a reliable source. And I stand by that. And that's why I think most police departments, and it goes to marketing, kind of like you said, nobody clicks on a headline where an officer did a really great thing, which, by the way, happens every single day. Every day. And no, that doesn't sell papers. That's not clickbait. No one cares about that. They care about what fits this narrative. And again, the very small percentage, the one-off incident, the outliers, but that's what gets played over and over. And so I've kind of had enough of that. And so that's why my PIO comes from media. He's a former journalist. And he, as he calls it, he came over to the dark side to policing. But, he and we both agree is that we're putting out our content, and sometimes it's, good, bad, or indifferent. I think that this is also another issue in policing, is that this concept of blind loyalty, the thin blue line, means to us, it means, this brother sisterhood, the thin blue line is about service, but it also has a negative connotation. The thin blue line is also blind loyalty, is the concept of, I didn't see that, I didn't see a thing, right? And that is something as a profession that we need to fix, we need to get away from. And one of the things that I tout to my officers until I'm sure they're tired of hearing it, is that I will stand with you when you are right, but I will part with you when you are wrong. And I will stand in front of the podium. Unfortunately, here, with our training and the skills that our officers had, I have not had to stand at the podium and say, we could have done better today. But that day, I know it could happen at any moment. And I've said, I will part with you when you are wrong. And that's what we need to do, is unions, union leaders. It's one of the issues I see is unions and arbitration. I've fired several officers who should not be police officers who've gotten their jobs back via an arbitrator. And that's a problem in our profession. It's difficult to fire people. And so we need our union leaders on board to say, yeah, we don't want that person in our profession. And that's something that I think we need to change.
One of the things, so you just unpacked so much right there. So our values align. Transparency is important to you, and you live it. You live transparency. The people of Aurora hear directly from you. You've got an incredible following on Facebook and in several different platforms. You write blogs. You're an open book on what your thoughts are. You're very forward in your leadership. But what you just said, I will stand with you when you are right, and I will part with you when you are wrong. That's leadership, and that's the culture that you have created within your department, that accountability aspect. And the other thing that you unpacked during that I think is one of the main things we have to instill in our profession is that the front line to police misconduct, excessive use of force, racism, any other inappropriate behaviors is the police. We have to be the front lines. That street cop that comes out of the academy and gets out of FTO has to be rewired that you are the front lines. You police, if you're listening, if you don't like what happens following the unlawful murder of George Floyd, and you don't like these negative incidents, we have to be the front lines. And if we become the front lines, and if things like this are not tolerated, they will not happen. And if they do, they will be on much smaller scale. We won't need the news to report it or somebody to file a complaint because we will have taken care of it and we will have released the information through transparency.
Retweet. Yes, absolutely. We have to be able to police ourselves. We have to. And that is where that blind loyalty has to be completely eradicated. And this culture that we've created here, and I'm very proud of this organization. And even, my union president, we've gone to listening sessions, and they even despite our differences and despite, fighting for some officers who I believe should not be police officers, we're on the same page when it comes to, making sure that we've created a culture where people can come forward and say, hey, that cop I just worked with, did something that violated both policy or ethics. And our union has done a really great job of protecting that officer who has come forward. So, there is no, not backing them up on a stop. That doesn't fit in our culture. We've also, and that message does have to start from the top of what you tolerate. And again, being complicit. And that's where I, kind of go back to, just because it says it in your policy, if you don't practice it, then it's completely useless. But we have actually fired a police officer who was not the person committing the excessive force, but he stood by and watched as an officer slammed someone's head against the hood of a car who was handcuffed. And that officer who was standing there was interviewed, and he said the line, I didn't see anything. And he's right there on camera watching it happen. And we fired him for truthfulness. And so this is what you have to set from the top, and it has to permeate through the organization. Is that concept that blind loyalty will not be tolerated and that we have to police ourselves. And by the way, you're doing your peer officer a favor when you step in and you say, hey, you're a little agitated, I'll take it from here. So let's prevent those things from happening before we make headlines, before we make such a grave error. And errors in policing are not like errors as an electrician. If you snip the wrong wire, that's going to cost the company some money. You got to do it all over again. When we make errors, sometimes a heart stops beating. And so that kind of error, we have we cannot tolerate. And so we have to make sure that our training and our culture and our principles are all aligned with that preservation of life, period.
And you said a couple things there. It's just incredible. I listening to you talk about this, your passion, your vision, your insight. And, and officers, we're just human beings. We're just people. We have good days. We have bad days. We have to make decisions in split seconds and instants. Look, when you're punched in the face or kicked in the groin or thrown to the ground, you react like human beings react, right? And so I think for police, and as we teach people that, hey, we're the front lines, that's not a bad thing. That's going to be maybe taken negatively by some officers. Like we're when you step in and intervene, when this human being who is a police officer starts to lose their temper or lose their cool or is having a bad day, you are helping them. You are preventing incidents from happening, right? I mean, and that's the mindset. There's so many different mindset shifts that we have to take. There's a couple things that coming up. And so I came into the profession in 96. And I remember specifically in the trainings, and we're seeing shifts in this, but the warrior mentality versus the guardian mentality, right? The over glorification of SWAT and foot chases and fighting people and those things. The second thing was this philosophy. I remember it in field training: ask, tell, make. Major problem. We've made a lot of strides in that in our de-escalation and our training. But the last one, which I think is still too prevalent today, is we have to win. And not from a side of just winning, but that losing is life or death, right? And so while losing in 1 or 2% of all interactions that police face is life or death, 98% of what we do, losing isn't death. And so we can't, our officers can't look at it through that lens. And that all starts with training, as you've talked about, the force on force. And so we created force on force live training. It's so much different. And we bought the suits and stuff. We had the interactions, but you've taken that to one step above. And I haven't been the police chief now for 3 years. I'm currently the city manager of Dixon. And I'm going to go back and check to see if our force on force training involves officers walking in and seeing an officer using excessive force or doing something wrong and how they interact, because that's so powerful. But I think we've got to make sure that these shifts and transitions happen. There's times for us to be warriors. They're very limited times. I think I read a blog you wrote on this. But guardians can be warriors and protectors, and that needs to be the mindset. Your thoughts on that? Absolutely.
This is an argument that I get into quite a bit, and especially in the community. And as you mentioned, I'm pretty out there in the community and on social media, and I do put my thoughts out there.
Love it.
And some of which gets a lot of pushback, which I appreciate, because there have been times, where I'm like, wow, I didn't think of it like that. And that's the whole point. I'm certainly not saying I'm right. I'm saying this is my opinion and this is how I formulated it. So the concept of guardian and warriorship, I absolutely believe that police officers should first and foremost be guardians. That's what we're here for, to keep the peace in our community so people can work, live, and play and feel safe while they're doing it. So 99.9% of the work that our officers do day in and day out is about guardianship. And by the way, that still is law enforcement. A guardianship is perhaps writing a ticket for someone who's, going 20 over the speed limit, because they're guarding life. When you're speeding, you have a higher propensity of getting into a car accident, which means, that you may not go home, and so that is still guardianship. So enforcing laws is a form of guardianship. It's sometimes it's not well received, because when you receive a ticket, it doesn't feel great, but that's still part of guardianship. Even making an arrest, a lawful arrest is part of guardianship, but we can still do that while treating people with human dignity and respect. And so I'm gonna make two comments and I'm gonna come back to one, which is about outcome. But the second point to that is that we are guardians. There is no doubt, but I will absolutely stand firm, and I will argue the fact that we also have to have living inside us a warrior mindset. And that is because that we are the first line of defense for our cities. take yourself to 9/11, the worst terrorist attack that has ever befallen our nation. And black helicopters from the military didn't come from the sky. It was police officers and firefighters that ran in and not only tried to save people, but tried to figure out where the threat was coming from. So is that a warrior? Yes, it is. And I use my own example here in this city, on February 15th, 2019 at 1:24 p.m. when the call of an active shooter went out that he already shot 5 people within this factory, and the officers responded. Those officers went into warrior mindset and they got shot one after another. And they went through that 300,000 foot warehouse looking for the shooter so he wouldn't hurt anyone else. And again, 5 of them shot while doing it. You can't tell me that that's not a warrior mindset. So I will push back on anyone that says, that we shouldn't be warriors, because there are some people, a lot of people. How many times do you get the comment, oh, I could never do what you do. I could never run towards that gunfire. Well, there's a reason for that. That's what first responders do. They put themselves in harm's way for people they've never even met before. So I will absolutely stand firm with that. There has to be a warriorship living inside them. However, warriors with good purpose. And that goes back to what I wanted to say before about outcomes. You're right. We're not playing a win or lose game here. And if you've read Simon Sinek's book, The Infinite Game, it has nothing to do with policing, but it literally has everything to do with what you just said, is that it's not about winning and losing. It's about the best possible outcome. So when you look at a situation where a person is running away, and they're shot, hold on, was that the best possible outcome? You know who they are, and could we be better, in our reactions, and again, win or lose means live or die. So is the best possible outcome is that we don't get that person right in that moment, but a life is spared? Well, yes, of course. I mean, it's illogical to think otherwise. So we have to start thinking about the infinite game and what the best possible outcome is. But I will say that we are guardians 99% of the time. But when the defecation hits the oscillation, then we have to have that mindset, and that's what sets first responders apart.
You were really awesome, and you can see why the Aurora Police Department is looked at as one of the best police departments in the entire country. It's not just you, I know that, but I firmly believe, and I'll argue with you on this one, that individuals and organizations rise and fall with leadership.
Yeah.
Because you look at organizations, and I can think of 4, I'm not going to call them out on this podcast, on this video. I can think of 4 different examples where all that changed was the top leader, the CEO, the sheriff, the executive director, right, the city manager,
Sure.
And everything changed. And it wasn't because they were the best thing ever, but they understood leadership. A lot of the things Simon Sinek talks about, they understand it's about people, and they really know how to empower people, give them the tools they need, instill the right values and culture, and then get out of their way and let people do the things that people do, right?
Yep. That is the only thing that I will take any credit for, is that my recognizing the fact that, that almost everybody in the room is smarter, more tactical. And so I have put the right people in the right position. So I know how to pick a pony. And so I know that, that our SWAT commander who oversaw our entire team and was the incident commander on the day of our mass shooting, I knew when I first became chief that he needed to be in that position. And I also knew, now I've never been in a tactical trajectory in my career. I've never been on the SWAT team. I've been more community oriented. I was as an investigator. So I don't know what I don't know. And I'm super comfortable saying I have no idea. And when he came to me and said, we need these tools and this equipment, I said, the only thing that I ask of you is to tell me, educate me on what these are. I didn't know what 9 bangs were, and as it turned out, that's what saved lives that day inside of that factory, is it pushed the shooter into a corner just by deploying those 9 bangs. I didn't know what that was, but I trusted him. I said, just let me know so I can speak intelligently about it when asked, to our city council and why we're spending the money on this. But he is the one that acted that day when his skills and talent and ability all came together with his and his team, notwithstanding our patrol officers who had already been trained to handle a mass shooting because we've had that scenario-based training so many times. So it's just putting the right people in the right positions. And to your point, I get the hell out of the way and then I watch it unfold like a choreographed dance. And then I, of course, have the benefit of going to the podium and saying, this is how they performed that day. They rose to the level of not only their training, but their expectations. And so that, as a leader, that's the only thing I'll take credit for, is putting the talented people in their positions and empowering them to do what they do best.
So I'm speaking with Chief Kristen Ziman of the Aurora, Illinois Police Department. And one thing I want to put out there, because we're going to have police officers, community members, different people. We're talking about policing in America, right? And we're talking about solving some of the problems and issues we face. But a lot of the scenarios and the things you've talked about, we want to say to the police, first and foremost, we are huge fans of police. The serving as a police officer was the greatest gift to me, and being able to make positive impact and change. And so as you listen to this, regardless of which side you're on or what, there isn't a side. This is all about how do we make our country better, our communities better, our state better. Know that one of the things I'm most grateful for is I never had to be in a deadly force encounter. Like, police officers hope to never have to be in a deadly force encounter. And the other thing is to bring to life, because these aren't the stories we're seeing on the national news, is that in the active shooter situation, February 15th, 2019, 1:24 p.m., that's going to be stamped in Chief Ziman and her team's memories forever. The bravery and the courage. Think about 5 people were killed during this active shooter. Think about how many people would have lost their lives. Think about the destruction. Behind every single death, there is a family, right? And think about how many lives would have been lost if it wouldn't have been for the bravery and the courage of these Aurora police officers. The first officer goes in, is shot. The next officer goes in, is shot. The next, not deterred. There was no other way. These men and women are putting their lives on the line, willing to trade their life for the lives of others. And is this profession perfect? No. Do we have things to work on? Yes. Let's acknowledge a lot of positive and incredible things have been done. And across the 18,000 police departments across this country, there are so many great men and women serving us. There are some, like as doctors and lawyers and judges, like as teachers and nurses, right? Like in all these different, there are some that aren't making the grade. There are some that are racist. There are some that there's misconduct. And so what we're talking about today is how do we, we're silly to think we're going to eliminate it from any profession, but how do we continue to reduce it? How do we continue to get better? And how do we continue to take on these problems? So I just want to say loud and clear, we own the history. Chief Ziman and I own the history for the profession and encourage others to do that and understand it. But while standing by the brave men and women that are keeping our community safe day in and day out, even if they show up to a house that says defund the police, they're doing their job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the point to drive home here, is that, and that's where that blind loyalty concept comes from, is that, we have to recognize, within our profession, and you mentioned other professions, and we have this term that we call them bad apples, right? Is, there's only a few bad apples in the bushel. Well, I just heard former Chief Chuck Ramsey say, I thought, the most profound thing. And he said, we always talk about the bad apples. We always talk about the bad apples. But what we have to do is figure out why those apples are coming from the tree. So they're coming from this tree. So you have to pare the tree. You have to take care and consideration into this tree. And if bad apples are coming from it, you need to figure out why. And that's what it comes down to, the most basic and simplistic forms of recruiting, who we bring into this profession, who we allow to put on this uniform and to wear this star. And we have to do the very best that we can. We have to do all the work on the front end to put people through psychological tests, through polygraphs, through an extensive background check that goes beyond just calling your 4 references that you write down who are only going to say good things things about you, you know? So our background, you know, we're trying to delve into who this human being is. You know, we look at social media content. All of those things tell me a story about who you are. What you've said and what you've put out into the universe tells me who you are. And when people show you who they are, believe them. And so that is the most simplistic, and you're right, it's any profession. But we really need to look at law enforcement on who we bring in, and we can't take a shortcut in recruiting. We have to bring in the best of the best, and we have to do our very best to pair that tree. And you're absolutely right. Are there going to be people who slip through the cracks? Maybe, you know, they got one over on us, or, you know, that we didn't figure out exactly who they are. Well, then you have to build in mechanisms in your organization to then get rid of them. And that includes creating policy that you follow, you know, and making sure that when you do try to have someone leave the profession, when a chief tries to terminate someone who is that quote bad apple, that termination should stand. And so we have to stand firm, you know, with our unions and make sure that we are all in lockstep on getting rid of these bad apples. But it's a work in progress. And that's where I see this as, you asked me what I was passionate about. The answer is policing, police officers, but policing and what it could be. And we have to all come together. And just like, you know, I've heard this analogy about doctors, you know, they call it a practice, you know, because they continually train to get better. And that's exactly what we need to do as a profession. We need to acknowledge that that good is the enemy of great, and that we have a lot of great qualities when it comes to the aforementioned, you know, running towards things in service, you know, in equity. But we most certainly can get better in our policies and you know, in our processes and our systems. And I think most of that is truly the human factor, is bringing in that human factor and bringing in empathy, you know, and not hiding behind the mirrored sunglasses and attitude, you know, kind of persona that we've come to know that cops are, and, you know, and showing who we are as people and being authentic and, God forbid, even vulnerable to our community. And I think that's where trust builds, as when we see each other as people, when we look at people and not down on them.
Wow. You talked earlier about how all of problems in society have kind of been guided to and directed at the police, right? Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of problems in our society that end up in some form or another at our front door. And to solve the complex issues in policing, mm-hmm. and the things you talked about were homelessness, substance use disorder, mental health issues, you know, those kinds of things. To solve the issues facing policing, mm-hmm. is to solve many issues facing our country. And so what I say now is that to solve these complex issues cannot just fall on the police. Because when we look at crime, and we dig down, you know, I've got my master's degree from Western Illinois University. I did a bunch of research on crime. And when you control for certain factors, and you look at the disproportionate arrest and imprisonment of Black males compared to others, like the underlying factor when you control for variables is poverty. Poverty is a major, major issue. Equal access to quality education, broken family structures, you know, rundown neighborhoods and geographic areas. There's so many issues and complexities that drive this problem that lead us to these flashpoints. So my thing is, we can't, everything's been dumped in the police's lap, and we agree, hey, we're not equipped to handle everything, but solving this problem can't be ours alone. So I ask you, Chief Ziman, who are the key stakeholders that we've got to bring together with the police mm-hmm. to make this meaningful change that both of us are 100% committed to seeing, and that most, and I say most, of the 18,000 police agencies across our country would be committed to making?
Right. And I think that goes back to the Sir Robert Peel principle of the police are the public and the public are the police. And I say that because I believe that it is our community that decides, you know, what level of policing that they want from us. And what I mean by that is, right now, people call 911 because of the homeless person, on the street. And we say homelessness is not a crime. Now we can say, move along, but, they call us when there is a mental health issue. And so we truly are the ones who are responding to these calls. So the stakeholders are our community members. They are the ones who need to tell us what they need and want from us. Kristen Ziman's opinion in this is that you cannot completely eradicate police officers. You cannot, the abolitionists that say, we shouldn't even have police forces, and here is why. Just a few days ago, I was told on the street that we had a social worker who was dealing with a suicidal subject. And several, I think, hours into it, the social worker said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. The person was becoming more violent. And so the police officer was there then to take over. And of course, we're also negotiators. Our officers go to negotiation school. So they're skilled negotiators on top of being law enforcement officers. And so they were able to bring this incident to a peaceful outcome where no one was injured. But that social worker said, I can't do this anymore, because people do turn violent. And that is the ugly part of humanity that people really don't want to face, is that there are people out there that do bad things to other people. I mean, it's just simply the nature of humanity. And it's the dark underbelly of law enforcement, is that we see this violence that, that people, that befalls people. So what I believe is that there has to be a hybrid. I believe that there should be a hybrid of social workers who should go in and try to bring that situation to a peaceful resolution using their skill and ability. But once then it progresses to a point where, you have to bring us in, then we should be at the ready. So I don't support a one or the other. And I think that that's kind of where we're at right now, is defund the police, abolish the police. Let's let social workers and other professionals come in and fix this problem. We don't need the police to over police us until you need the police, and then when we're not there, our social worker is going to come out at 3:00 in the morning when someone is having a violent episode. I don't know, but I firmly believe that the solution lies not in, in the 2+2. It's the 2 + 2 = 5. Honestly, it is this. I think that there's something bigger that we can come up with, that maybe none of us have thought of. And I think for me, the way my mind is going, it is that it's a hybrid of having, mental health and specialists come in, and we're right there with them, standing at the ready to protect not only them, but the person, with whom is having a crisis.
Absolutely. So something that it's easy for somebody to say. So I honestly, maybe laugh is the wrong word, but when people are like talking about replacing us with social workers or mental health professionals, look, the reality is, and it has a lot to do with the fact that there isn't proper funding allocation and those jobs don't pay well. There are a lot of issues and problems in the mental health system and the substance use system. So let's unpack this a little bit. So people may not know this. There is virtually nowhere for us to send somebody who is suffering from chronic schizophrenia.
Right.
It's the reason why the Cook County Jail is the largest mental health institution in the country, right? We go in and deal with a situation, somebody suffering from schizophrenia. We try to get them help. We make calls. We make calls as the police. The state's attorney's making calls. Sometimes judges are making calls. The sheriff's making calls. Mental health professionals are making calls. The CEO of a hospital is making calls. And there's nowhere for them to go. We've got a mental health system where somebody who's suffering from bipolar disorder is entering a manic episode, and the family calls in to try to get an appointment and ask for help. This happened with one of our team members' sons. And she's then talking to me, crying her eyes out, because she knows today that they can't involuntarily commit him, but they're going to be in 10 days.
Yeah.
So in his appointment, they can't get him in for 3 weeks, right? There's a broken system there that isn't ready to support what we need, which is why the police have had to go out and get all this different specialized training. The other thing on substance use disorder, so we created the second program in the country that puts heroin addicts to treatment instead of jail. And now anybody with substance use disorder to treatment instead of jail. Now there's 500 programs across the country. To create that program, we had to go out and get treatment partners with 10 different agencies. The closest one is an hour away. Most are 2.5 hours away. And before we did that, even if we called as the police, we would get put on 2-week waiting periods. Well, when somebody comes in and asks for help for substance use disorder, that's a moment in time. They might not be ready in 5 or 6 hours or tomorrow. And so I think I just want to bring an awareness and understanding that these systems, and the reason all this falls on the police is because these systems aren't strong enough. There's incredible people in them, the hearts of these people and the intentions, but there isn't capacity. Mm-hmm. And so to just simply say this stuff, like for me, I'm like, well, this doesn't even make sense because we can't even get this one person to where they need to go. We've got to put them in jail because they've committed a crime, because that's the only place they're actually safe. Mm-hmm. So it's a major issue. You've had the similar experiences, right?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. And so that's why, we go back to the defund the police. Well, whoever coined that phrase obviously does not have a marketing degree. It's terrible because, it's again, such a negative connotation about defunding policing when really it should be let's fund social services. Let's fund hospitals so that the police don't have to intercede, where we really shouldn't, and I was going to say where we're not trained, but the fact is we've had to become
we are trained now.
Yeah. All of these things. Yeah. I mean, so it before we weren't, but now we're using a lot of our money and resources in training officers on how to deal with mental health issues and how to respond to these situations. And you're absolutely right. There is a gap, and that the only person to call is 911, because you're right, that's where they're safe. And so you want to talk about funding and stakeholders, first of all, pay social workers and DCFS workers and, all of substance abuse counselors, all of the people who have entered into such a service profession, pay them more. So you attract more people to the profession, and then give them facilities and give them resources so they can deal with these issues. So we're not looking at it getting to the point where the police have to be called in. So it's all about preventative measures. So if people truly wanted or had, wanted to solve this problem, then we need to delve into these problems and then provide resources there. I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I oversimplify things, or, like I have 3 eyes, is that it's not that difficult to see that there are no stopgap resources in the middle of an episode and 911. So let's figure out whatever that mechanism is and let's do it.
Yeah. And I think the truth is, when we unpack these things, is there a need for leadership? Is there a need to shift in some places or to strengthen in others, cultures and policing? Is there a need for police to be the front lines of misconduct and abuse and authority? All those things are true. But as we look at this problem and this issue, if we're going to find real solutions and we just don't want to talk about it, we've got to fully understand it. There's things that are going to need to happen at the national and the state level, but they're not going to bail us out. So something that came back to you, who are your stakeholders? They're your community. And a lot of these issues and problems are going to be solved community by community. And I think that the international chiefs, and I know the Illinois chiefs as well, are doing a good job with stakeholders like the ACLU and Black Lives Matter and NAACP, involving the faith-based community. We've got to have the support of the elected officials and not just talk in politics, like support and action. NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officers. But then, and I believe this, we are going to need the help and the support of the media, of the national media, to share what is real. Because we can do all this, but if a tree falls in the woods and it doesn't make a sound, it didn't really fall, right? Like these things, and one of the things, as we start to wrap up, and you do an amazing job of this, you're one of the most transparent people I know, that tell our story. Cops for so long, and I know it's noble, like, well, we don't need to brag about what we do. We don't do our job to receive accolades. Law enforcement leaders listening, you have to tell your story. You have to intentionally tell your story, tell the good and the bad. Every bad situation is a bigger withdrawal than all the deposits. But that's why we just got to continue to make deposit after deposit, because those things are happening everywhere. But we've got to do a job of telling our story. And as you said before, like, we're going to share it. We're going to share the whole video. So you're just not getting a headline that wants to shape you this way. And so so many great things from this conversation. I want to give you a chance to kind of wrap up. And I know we're going to watch this back and think about some other areas I want to talk about, or we didn't hit there, but for the length of this show, you know, what are some final thoughts, some parting things that you want to share?
So, you know, I think we find ourselves in such an obscure time and place in our history, you know, and as we look back on this moment in time, going from literally one crisis to another, you know, from a pandemic to civil unrest, we cannot waste this opportunity. And what I mean by that is that we have to figure out what this moment in time is trying to teach us, and whether we are open to hear the lesson that it is trying to provide us. And if we aren't listening, as you mentioned earlier, really truly listening to the voices that perhaps, you know, have been drowned out, then we're not going to make any progress. So the very first thing we need to do is exactly what Chief Cunningham started in that moment, when he said, "I am sorry. I am deeply and just consumingly sorry," and mean that. There are 3 parts to an apology. We were wrong, I'm sorry, and now what can I do to fix it, right? And again, even if you didn't have a part in that, even if it's not your fault, you're responsible. So the first thing that we have to do is figure out, what can we do to fix it? And so that means listening to stories and understanding that just because it didn't happen to you, because you didn't personally experience it, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And we get into a lot of arguments in our department about facts versus feelings, you know, and well, just because someone feels something doesn't mean it's true, except that that's a very powerful antidote to feel something. And so for sure, facts absolutely matter, but feelings do as well. And we have to be able to balance that and move away from just the facts, ma'am, to, okay, let me try and understand how you're feeling. And so I think our first step, as we navigate through these waters, is truly to listen to one another and then try to come up with solutions together. And that's why the police cannot do it by themselves. That's why the community has to be right there with us, listening to our side as well, listening to what it feels like to be a police officer. And, you know, so we have to start listening sessions. We have to start conversations, whether they're formal or informal. But I think that is where we begin. And then I think police departments who are progressive have these policies in place, but now they had better check whether they are following these policies, whether they are walking that talk. And then if they don't have the policies in place, to get them in place and to start doing the right thing. But our profession needs an upgrade. And I think that the first step is recognizing that, even as a police officer, and saying, we can be better. You know, I got that tattooed on my arm, be better. Be better, just as a reminder, you know, that this is what we as a police department, as a policing profession, is that we have to be better, but we have to be willing to listen. So I think that's the first step. And I'm a realist, but, you know, with a tinge of optimism in me, and I believe that we are going to come out of this stronger together than we were before. And so I think that the only way to do that is use this as an opportunity.
Absolutely. The greatest challenges equal the greatest opportunities. Many times the obstacle is the way. The tougher the situation, the farther we gotta lean in. And you talk about some different things, and the thing that comes to my mind is the value of commitment to excellence. It's a value that I'm driven by. It's a value that drives our police department, drives our city, drives our teams. And we've got to realize that no matter how good of a job we're doing or how great we're doing, that excellence is not a destination. Excellence is a place that we can visit from time to time, but there's always room to get better, even if that's 1%. And if you're at that level, you got to be looking for ways to add layers of greatness every single day to get that 1% better. I do want to thank and acknowledge all those people out there who are trying to make a difference, and doing so in a peaceful way, coming from a place of love, wanting to make real positive change to protesters who are using their voice, and to, you know, the leaders of Black Lives Matter, to the police officers who are showing incredible bravery and courage, and who are acting as punching bags, you know, in our current environment, but are still going out and answering that call every day. The importance of listening, of Covey's fourth habit, seek first to understand, then be understood, to be able to separate our professional from our personal, right? When we put on that badge, we do represent an institution, and to just keep looking for ways to make our communities, our state, our country a better place. And I agree with you. I believe when we look at the challenges, and you look back at all the challenges that have been overcome in the history of our country, that we will overcome this and we will make strides. We've come so far. We have so far to go. Yeah. But Chief Kristen Ziman, thank you so much for joining me today. I just cannot thank you enough. All the value you've added to this conversation, the context you brought to policing in America.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love the discussions, and I think we need to keep them going all over.
We do. To our listeners, you know, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Apple, Spotify, Google. Will be on Amazon soon. All the other ones. Please subscribe, give us a rating, share that with your friends. And remember, always be committed to excellence.